Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's Capture One webinar, and today with a very special guest, which is Derek Heisler. Are you there, Derek?
I am. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. So cracked you out of the cold from Canada. So thanks for joining us today. If you don't know who you're listening to, I'm the guy at the top, David, part of the software sales team based out of Copenhagen in Denmark. And then Derek, and I've managed to spell Calgary in Canada right as well, I think, which is where you are right now. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Excellent, excellent. And as usual, we've got 60 minutes today with both of us. You're very welcome and encouraged to ask questions to Derek and myself throughout. The way you do that is just via text. So at the bottom of your GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see the last section is called questions. Just put a question in, that will come through to me. I'll just keep an eye on them and feed them through to you, Derek, as we go. If we don't get to your particular question, don't be offended. There is quite a lot of you, so I'll just sort of pick and choose the common threads and the ones of interest. So, and as I understand it, Derek, you've got a bunch of images which you've chosen, and we're going to look at various things that you do to them in Capture One and some of your techniques, because you are quite keen on the color grading aspects, as I understand.
That's correct.
Okay, nice one. All right, well, let me make you the presenter. And with a bit of luck and technical know-how, we should be okay, I think.
All right.
Let's see. Yep, we can see your screen now. Fantastic.
Awesome.
Excellent. And you're on Windows, which will make our Windows people happy, because I'm always on Mac. But I mean, it's relatively 99% the same between Mac and Windows. If you're on a Mac, don't be upset. It's everything that you see here is just as valid for Mac or PC.
Yeah, and I'm a blended user, so on set I'm tethered to my MacBook, which is using Capture, and then when I'm editing, I just have a PC, just because I can build a faster system, and it just it tends to work a little bit better that way. So
for much less money, I assume, as well.
Yeah, as much as I love one of those new Mac Pros, yeah, this is definitely more cost effective.
For sure.
But yeah.
And I noticed that just looking before we get to the image side of things, that you've got your own custom setup as well.
Yes.
Workspace, rather, I should say, not setup, so custom workspace. So maybe you could just spend 1 minute on that, just talking about your arrangement, so people know what they're looking at as well.
For sure. So that's, I mean, the first thing, if you're new to Capture One, you'll notice that there's a ton of tabs up here at the top, and these will actually look quite different also if you're running just the default workspace. So you'll see that there's a default workspace up here, and there's a few presets, and I've made a new one, and as you can see, I had an older one, and now I've got a 2017, simply just because of the Capture 11 additions, like layers, for example. That way, then I kind of just updated the UI to basically work with my workflow, and that's the biggest thing about Capture One, is that once all these tools are all basically, you can pull them out, you can add new tools, so they all exist within this panel, and then you can add new tabs as well, and then you can kind of add your own icon. So I just number them here, so I know that it's like I'm starting here, and then I'm moving basically left to right till export. So basically, you can make these to whatever you want. My recommendation is definitely having layers kind of available to you at the beginning, or even across the tabs that you've got, just simply because it's now you can do adjustments just on those layers, and you can actually fine tune the opacity of those specific layers, which is something unique to Capture 11. So basically, the way I kind of like to work, and the other thing too is you'll notice there's this white kind of border, and if I zoom in, you'll notice that white border doesn't move. It's just a proofing border that you can get to through preferences. I do it just because it gives me, it's funny because I actually saw this when I started out on a Capture. I noticed another photographer do this. and I've done it ever since. It's always good to know when you're editing to know what true white is. So having that, and also gives you an idea of what the relative contrast is. So the problem with working in all black with a black edge is you don't really know how the image is going to look on white. And so I have this in here so that I always know because you'll see more details, right? But this causes you to lose some of the details in the shadows. So it makes you bring up those so that it looks good overall. So that's why I've got this in here. As ugly as it may look in the UI, it looks nice with the black. It has a function purpose, so that's why I've got it there.
Yeah, it's something I've just started doing myself as well, and it just does help to, as you say, if you know what true white is, it tends to help you get a better job of the exposure, I think. But give it a try yourself and see what you think. It looks weird at first, but certainly think it helps in balancing the image better.
Definitely, and the nice thing is you don't lose this when you zoom in. It's always here. So if you're working close up on an image, you'll be at least able to still see it. Hopefully everything isn't too small for you guys. We're working on a 27-inch screen here, so
no, looks good. Can you just show where that is in the preferences? A couple of people asked.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So I believe
it's under appearance.
I think it's appearance. Yeah. So we've got it right here under the viewer. So you can go white, and then you can add the margin, and then there's the proof margin. So I believe the proof margin is the one that's persistent on zoom.
Yeah, the proof margin you can toggle on and off. It just gives you a even bigger border, if you like. So you've got your viewer toolbar hidden, but it's basically this sort of little box that pops up in the top left. So yeah, you can set those to whatever you like. So if you want a really big fat frame, then you can just adjust margin and proof margin to whatever pixel you would like.
Exactly. So yeah, make sure that the great thing about Capture One is, make it yours, because everyone's workflow is a little bit different. And the biggest thing is that this is about saving time. So you want to make sure that you've built Capture One to kind of do it yourself. And what I tend to do is, especially with, I think it was 11, and just trying to understand the new changes and how that workflow would affect my current. I was actually working on a project where I was working on something like 40 images, and you do enough of those images, you find out, I'm always using this tool at this point, or I'm using this tool at this point, and you build essentially like a top-down, left to right type workflow, so that you're basically just kind of, and it reminds you to, sometimes if you're working on individual images, to maybe try something a little bit different just because that tool is there. So just to see if it works, especially if you're kind of in experimental. So, and you're just choosing your grade.
Exactly.
But I can go quickly into kind of how I do my workflow with layers. So this new addition to 11 is really nice, because what I'll do is I break up kind of everything by a layer, because it gives me that ability to change the opacity and essentially the strength of whatever I'm doing. So I'll break up, I've got curve here, but you could name it exposure, whatever you want, but I'll essentially try and get the look of the exposure that I want first and have that just on one layer on its own. So what I've got is here, I've got the original raw image from my Canon here, and then this is what we're kind of trying to essentially get to. So if we look at the first layer, in the curve, you'll notice, okay, well, I brought down some of the highlights and some of the shadows just to kind of give it this more muted look. So the way I shoot commercially tends to be what I would say is closer to kind of my brothers and sisters in film, where we're focusing on getting to make sure we don't lose anything in the shadows, we're not losing anything in the highlights, so that when we go to grade, we essentially have full control of that. So that's why I used to shoot, like film, where it was get everything in camera, but I found that it didn't provide enough flexibility when it came to clients' needs after the fact. If they changed the creative, at the 11th hour and you've already shot the campaign, it's really hard for you to go back and make those changes. So I tend to shoot a little bit flatter, a little bit more open, so that I have the freedom to do something like this in post afterwards. So I'm sure the purists aren't too happy about that, but when it comes to commercial work, it's about functionality. So
and there's so much dynamic range, and I've said this many times that I mean your flat start point, I mean it's well within the realms of good exposure and so on. So I mean you've got so much data to work with that it's often surprising how far you can stretch the file before screwing it up, basically.
Definitely, and that's the nice thing also about doing all your grading and contrast in a raw processor is you have that availability to you, be it 14-bit or 16-bit, depending on the camera you're using. You have that information available to you versus kind of working on a TIFF later in Photoshop, right?
Yeah.
So let's just take a quick look here. So to create like a new layer, you just create it, and we'll just name this exposure if we want. And the only thing that you just have to keep in mind is Capture works on like a mask program. So when you create a new layer, you got to think about everything is basically black in like Photoshop. So the mask is essentially black. There's nothing there. So if you make adjustments to this, like Calvin, for example, you'll notice nothing happens. So keep that in mind. What you have to do is you have to fill the mask. So if we go into mask mode, so I filled it, you'll notice it changed essentially the color that was there. So if we fill it and we press M on the keyboard, you'll notice everything is red. So everything is painted in right now. That's essentially what you'll have to do if you want to create a layer that is affecting obviously everything. So with exposure, we're doing an overall adjustment to the image, right? So we're going to want to make sure that we click this kind of dot, 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 and we go down to fill. Now there's a bunch of other, you'll see there's refine mask, there's feather, invert. So if we did invert, nothing's going to be selected, right? The mask is not on. And then there's obviously tools here that we've got like drawing, erase, and gradient. So these work just as you'd expect them to. For example, with the brush, you're going to have, I'm using just as I would in Photoshop, you've got your right and left square brackets to change your size. You can right click here and change your opacity and everything as well. But if we turn the mask on, you'll notice when I'm painting, you can see the red going in. So we're only affecting that area, which is kind of nice. Now, for example, if let's say you're working on something, this is one tool that I always use, is if let's say we just want to select him, or even just let's say his head, we can just go like this. We can just kind of do a rough mask like this, and we have this ability to fill that mask. So what that's going to do is everything that's kind of outlined just gets filled automatically. Saves you a ton of time, especially when you're working on a ton of images that have unique masks per image. It's a big time saver. Now the other thing too is you've noticed I'm really easy and sloppy on this mask. So I try to save myself time. So there's feather, which basically will give you that, as you would expect in Photoshop. But refine mask is something new. And if you notice here, it'll come in. Now, if I turn this way up, you'll notice how it essentially kind of dials itself in to the closest elements that were essentially masked on the edges, and it kind of does some smart work. It has some bleeding sometimes, depending on how messy it is and how complex the background is. But I find that this works really well if you're doing slight adjustments. And the great thing about, even if I click apply like this, and I go back into refine, you notice I can still dial this. So it's all, these masks are non-destructive in a way.
Yeah, that's quite a good tip, that you can double refine or triple refine, and actually sometimes starting with an auto mask is a good start point, but even the super sloppy mask method actually works pretty nicely as well, and don't be afraid to keep on refining if you need to.
And the biggest thing too is if you're masking before you make adjustments, you don't really know what it's going to do until you actually do it, right? So if we press M again to turn off the mask so we don't see it, and I make this adjustment, I don't know, let's just do something crazy, but we do like a clarity or something like that, and you notice that it's, actually let's do a little bit more of a shift where we actually see it affect the background. So you can see that, okay, it's starting to get a bit red here. and I don't really want that effect to come out there, that's where you could come back into the refine mask, and you can play with this to see, you know, is it going to bleed more? Is it going to bleed less? And it will, if you have this checked, basically you can see how it's going to affect the edges. And then also, again, if you're like, okay, well, I need to refine this a bit more, you can go in with the eraser, get up close, and essentially, you know, paint out that excess area that you don't want affected. So there's kind of multiple ways, I would say, to approaching, you know, dealing with masks, but it kind of shows that you can kind of approach it from a few different angles and play with that. The other nice thing, like on a project that I recently worked on, we had 40 images and we had to make the hands basically blend in with the face, which is difficult, but what we were able to do is we took one test image, got the hands to where we wanted it to with our layer, and then we actually just removed the mask, and then we applied that layer to every image. And then what we just went in and just painted the mask for the hands. The work was already done, and we could see how it affected it in live. So that was very, very helpful. So let's just go back to this. So make sure, obviously, you know, we've got the mask filled. So you can always check it by pressing M. Also, if you make adjustment, it doesn't do anything, you'll know that you're doing it incorrectly. And so what we did was we kind of brought down the shadows a bit here to get it to where we kind of wanted it to be. You can kind of get a feel for how that's going to look. And then, you know, if the highlights are a little too much, we can kind of just blend those a bit more to get something that's a little bit more what we were looking for exposure wise. Now keep in mind, we're not looking at color here. Obviously his skin is too saturated for the look that we're going for, but try to compartmentalize how you kind of approach this. You know, right now we're just working on exposure. And if we look at any of the other things, it looks like everything else is kind of as is. We've just kind of changed that. Now, if you notice here, if you're new to Capture, you'll notice this is kind of the typical curve that you would see in Photoshop. You've got RGB, and then you've got your individual channels, which you would use for color grading if you wanted to use that. Now there's this fourth one here, which is Luma, which I believe is unique to Capture One. And what it does is it gives you the ability to have an RGB curve. But if you've ever noticed, if you really push a curve in RGB, it'll do weird things to saturation. You know, either punching, making skin orange, or whatever. Where the Luma curve is only affecting luminance, so just the darkness and the brightness. There's no effect of actual saturation to the skin tone. So I always use that when I'm doing curves in Capture, just simply because it gives a much better result versus, you know, using this and then seeing how, you know, that's starting to affect the actual saturation of the image. And it's even more prominent when you've got a lot of color in the image itself. So we've got this, and the nice thing is, you know, if we like this, but we find it's a little too heavy, at any point we can just pull it back with the opacity. So that's kind of the nice thing about the layers is a lot of the times I'll do an effect and then I'll pull it back to like 80 to 90%, so it has this more natural feel to it. So it's a good thing to have available to you. So the next one we're looking at is grade. So with grade, typically the way I work is I've got, and if you notice with the UI here, it'll tend to jump around based on what you have open. So just be aware that if something's, you know, not the way you want, just kind of expand it and you'll get kind of the tools that you want if you don't have enough space. But so this is a little different. So what I've done is I've got, like, this is basically exposure, you know, basic adjustments, and then my second tab here is solely just for color grading. And so what we want to make sure is, obviously we want to be working on a new layer here. So let's just create a new layer and we'll call it grade. And we want to make sure to remember that it's filled. so that everything we're doing will affect the whole image. So what I've got here is, this is Capture One's kind of, it's very much like DaVinci in a way where, for any of you guys that work in motion, you know, you've got your circles, you can kind of pull it manually anywhere you want, but you've also got saturation and luminance here as well. And what I've done is I've actually just multiplied this tool set 3 times, and I've got one for highlights, midtones, and shadows, because you can go with a 3-way, but as you can see, it's a bit small. Some people expand these out and they'll take up part of the screen, but I just like it nice and clean like this. So I have one for each, and that gives me the ability to kind of just work in each one of these. So if I wanted to kind of shift, let's say, the highlights into, let's say, a yellow, we could kind of do that and bring that in to get that kind of, you know, Annie Leibovitz feel. And then, you know, shadows, you could move that in the opposite direction. And the nice thing is you can kind of visualize that that color wheel and complementary colors, because you just kind of just whip to the other side to do that. So you can kind of create that grade that you want really, really quickly. Now, let's say, for example, because if you guys are new to this, there's this reset color balance adjustments. Now, this works great because it's on every single tool, and what it does is it just zeroes everything. The only problem is with this, it'll zero all of these because they're basically the same tool, right? They're just variations of it. But what David had taught me was, I think it's Control, right? You hold Control.
Yeah, or Alt-click. Yeah.
Yeah, and you just tap here. Yeah. And what it'll do is, if you hold Control and you click on that, it'll only affect that specific tool versus all of them.
Yeah, so Alt-click will do every single color balance, and then on the Mac, if you do Command-click, it will just do the specific color balance wheel, so shadow, midtones, or highlights. And then on PC, what was it, Derek? It was
it's Control.
Control. Okay.
Hold Control and then click on the arrow, and you'll get what you're looking for.
Yep.
Now I'm just going to see if I made any color adjustments in the curves here. No, it looks like basically just some color tones. So the other thing too is you have full control of where this goes. Like if you're finding this is too loose and happy to just pull in here, you can grab these sliders. So you can say, okay, I know I want like an orange, so that's where we're going. And then I can control the saturation of that orange. So you can see that it's more on that line. It's a lot more control, and then you can actually affect the luminance of the highlights itself. So if we wanted to, let's say, bring those down a bit, mute them a bit, we could go to there. So this way, then you have a little bit more control over where these sliders end up versus dragging here, because sometimes it's hard to be repeatable in here, but it's nice to play with. So if you're just trying to find you know, where you want the shadows to be, it's good to just play with the circle and drag it around until you find what fits, you know. If it's personal work, it's, you know, wherever you like it. But if it's commercial work, it's, you know, what falls on brand and, you know, what follows the creative brief from the agency. So you can kind of start in areas, and then you can have the ability to kind of tweak, you know, the effect as well, to make sure that it's, you know, something that's going to work for what you need. So for example, for this, if we wanted to have something that was a little bit more kind of you know, Hollywood kind of dingy back alley, this is Danny's backyard, so you'd never know. This is he has his lawnmower in this shed, so
just like any other typical guy.
Yeah. yeah, exactly. Yeah. I found the birdhouse a nice touch. So
nice touch. Yep.
Yeah. But yeah, so you can kind of play around with these to get to where you want. And it's so funny because I did this already, and it's always almost impossible to get back to exactly where you want it to be on your second go. But and I think also I went against myself, and I accidentally put another Luma in here, which I should have had on a second layer. But let's just take a look at what else I did here. So if we can kind of turn these off as we go back. So you can see there's the original image. We've got our curves, and then this is our grade that we applied. Now, the only thing I found with this is, now did I add additional color in here? This might be just an extra one here. But what I found was just in his face in here, I found that it was just a little muddy, a little dark. I know the information is there in the original image, but I needed to add that. So what I did was I went in with a brush and essentially just kind of painted in this shadowy area, and just brought up, you can see with the Luma, just a tad, just to get a little bit more luminance in his face, and then you can kind of see it there. It's just a little bit, but it makes a big difference. And then I wanted a bit of a vignette on the image itself, and so I added that. Now this is kind of interesting. A lot of people I know have requested vignettes for Capture One. Just being able to just have a slider. The only problem with that is you don't really have a lot of control with just a slider on a vignette. So I can show you guys a quick way of creating a vignette in Capture One. So what we'll do is let's just use this. Yeah, let's move on to the other one. We spent a little more time on that, but there's some nice layers on there to kind of go through. So we'll go through a couple more images. These are just 3 images from Set with Strong that I did that were outtakes. I just wanted to kind of show you guys some of the ways of speeding up, I guess, some of the stuff that we can do. So this was kind of the final image that I had gotten to within Capture, and this was essentially the straight out of the Canon when I shot it. So what I always do, like I said before, is keep the original, create a new variant, and you'll notice here it's there. Now sometimes they can be collapsed as well, and you can kind of see by clicking here, there's originals kind of built into there. So everything gets associated with that original one, and you can kind of wrap them up nicely as well. So if we look here, it looks like there's mostly, I probably went against my plan, but I think it mostly is just a grade that we applied to the actual image itself. So as you can see here, there's a shift, into the reds, or kind of orange, I guess, as well as in the midtones, because I wanted this image to be a bit warmer. Now, you could just pull up you could pull up your white balance here. The only issue with that is that it's not going to quite give you the same result. Oh yeah, and I should probably, here, we'll do it the way David said, so we've got it.
There you go, new filled layer. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. You can pull this up, but as you can see, this is not the look that we're going for. It's quite different. So I tend to like to do some of that stuff. Just let's see, is it going to go all the way back? There we go. I like to do that kind of in the grade itself. So you can kind of say, okay, well, we want some warmer tones in here. We can pull this and kind of start to get that warmer tone in the highlights. And we want, I believe I put the warmer in the shadows as well, so we can do that. And I always like to do these in this order, so highlights, shadows, and then go into the midtones. The midtones are going to be the biggest shift because obviously most of the information is there. And I like to kind of, especially if you're doing complementary colors, and you're doing a bit of a tint, it's always good to make sure that the highlights and the shadows are either together or opposing, just so that you're kind of playing with, the great things that the mind likes to look at. So if we kind of bring this up, and now remember, if we're like, oh, I can't really get to where I want to be, we can kind of dial this just to get the hue we want, and then we can kind of play around with that saturation to get it where we want, and then the luminance as well if there's, we want to add a little bit of a, I wouldn't recommend using this as much, because obviously it's color irrespective, like it's just affecting that range, the luminance of it. So obviously if you pull this way up and you're in the blacks, you're going to get that flatter black look, right? Mm-hmm. So we've kind of got where we want it to be, and we know we're going to move the midtones in there as well. So let's kind of bring those up a bit, and you can kind of start to see, that's a little too green. We want it to be a bit warmer, so we're there. Some of this stuff might be a bit much, so we can kind of bring it down. But it's really, you're going to be kind of going back and forth to where you want it to be. And as you can see here, there's a bit more luminance, I believe. We'll have to see where that is, because it could be just a shift. Oh, and I see what I did there. So this is another thing that I tend to like to do. And I did see it actually. I think it was in a Capture One webinar. So these are very important. But essentially, what you can do is you have a basic curve adjustment that you can apply from the basic characteristic from the thing. So auto is typically, I believe it's film standard. Typically is where it lands.
Film standard is the, if you use auto, just to explain to people, it doesn't do any auto adjustment. It just uses the film curve that was used to create the ICC profile, which 99.9% of the time is film standard.
Yeah. So if you notice with these, like extra shadow, it's a little bit softer in the shadows. High contrast is going to be obviously high contrast. And then we have linear response. Now, if you notice linear response, it's like, well, it's very flat. But if you notice, we have all this information. This linear response looks very much like a log, right, from motion footage. So this was something that another Capture One webinar instructor had shown, was he likes to start at linear, even though it's not where you want to end up, but it gives you more latitude in working with the image itself. So what you can actually do is you can actually bring up things like exposure from this point. But now you're like, oh, well, we're blowing out easier, but we have the ability to bring those back because that information exists. So that's an option, and I typically will use it in a lot of cases because it will give me that flatter starting point, and then I can add things later on. Be it clarity if you want to add that afterwards, because this gives you the ability to kind of give that extra punch without actually affecting the overall contrast of the image, which I prefer. So you get this kind of film look to it almost. Or if you're not one that if you like to be a little more selective with your clarity, sometimes you'll use I use a high pass filter in Photoshop to kind of get that look as well. So if we notice here, we've got that shift as well. And we've kind of got it to that point. Now, to kind of go a little bit further here, because I've just been sticking within these two tabs, which are basically my exposure and color, is output. So this is kind of where, as you can see, I made a bit of a mess of this, but I've got a few presets here that I've used for projects. There's everything from Photoshop or whatever. But the nice thing about this is, for example, if you've got a client that you're exporting stuff directly to them or to a retoucher, and they need multiple formats, you're able to export all these at the same time, depending on what you've selected. But you've got here, you make a preset, and you've got the option of exporting to Photoshop. You can do a TIFF, JPEG, and then you've obviously got control of 8 or 16-bit, depending on. Does the image, the way I use it is everything is typically 8-bit that I'll export because the sizes just get too large, unless there's a lot of gradation in the image itself. So if it's like a sky, for example, there's going to be very subtle gradation from like darker blues to light blues. You have a bit more control in pushing that later in Photoshop if it's 16-bit versus 8-bit. So it's really dependent on, it's do you want the extra file size and the pain of using that to make sure that you don't have to deal with, banding or something like that you would normally get with 8-bit if it's a very fine gradation. And you can always fix some banding with grain as well, right? So, but yeah, you can choose your ICC profile. So if you guys are going directly to web, you can use RGB, sRGB, or you can, if you want a little wider gambit, you can use Adobe RGB as well. And then here you can obviously, there's the output. So if you guys aren't familiar with the way sessions work, is you choose where it is and it's going to create a capture folder, so all your imported images go into there. And then there's a select folder, so you can move all your selects into that. And then there's an output folder, so everything that exports goes into that. So it just keeps everything nice and clean. But you can kind of, if you want to see where that is, you can click here. But you also have the ability to choose a folder and change that as well. And then here you can change the output naming if there's something different. And you select as many images as you want, you click process and just let it run. And you can have that also open up in Photoshop directly if you want, or a browser. there's a few other things in here as well, like lens correction and things like that. Like for example, this was shot with the 70-200 on my Canon, so obviously you're going to want to affect some things like aberration and you know, some distortion, things like that as well. So this is my shooting setup. My one thing I will mention is that my laptop, my tethering laptop, has a totally different setup because its need is different. It's on set. So I'll typically have like a capture tool tab, which you guys probably see in the default, which has the ability to kind of, you know, the camera information's here. You have some ability to change some things as well. You can even fire it from here. But the nice thing about tethering this is what I'll do is like I'll have this shot, like the original shot, and then I'll grade it the way I want for the client. So I know I've got the flat image that I need, that I've got the latitude that I need, but then I've got the thing that the client, you know, aesthetically pleasing that they like. And then what I do is I just have that that affect every image that comes after that capture. And this is where Capture One makes you look like a god on set, because you basically you shoot and it looks exactly, it gets that grade that you had done to the previous image right away. So there's like a slight delay depending on like how fast your machine is, but typically then now you're giving the client basically the final image without retouching every capture you're taking, so that they're not being distracted by, you know, that this is a blue tone and they're like, oh, that's bothering me, the image has to be warm. So you're removing things that would kind of get in their way, and you're saying this is what the final image is kind of going to look like. There might be a slightly more contrast or you know, and that's where you could do things where you could punch up the clarity to get that grittiness that you want, even though this might not be the final look that you're going for, but it'll give that client that feel that they need. And then every shot that you take is going to get automatically applied with that setting, so that you know, it's going to have that really, really nice look to it after every capture. So that's a nice thing that I found with Capture One, that basically has improved how things happen on set, and clients like how happy they are. And then what I will do is typically, if you also notice in here, there's Capture Pilot. So this is another thing that I do on set. Well, I'll just quickly mention is I'll have iPads for art directors or creative directors, and I'll set up Capture Pilot, give them access to it. Because if anyone ever notices with art directors or creative directors, they want to see every image. And when I started shooting and tethering, they were just kind of like over my shoulder the whole time. And sometimes that can kind of affect the momentum of a photo shoot. And so I'll give them an iPad, give them Capture Pilot. So every image that I shoot basically gets sent to the iPad. They see it as it comes out of camera. They can rate it if they want, you know, star rating, or color code them. They can zoom in to 100% right on the iPad. And you give them a coffee, put them on a couch, and, you know, everybody's happy. So
keep them out the way.
yeah, basically. And then they can kind of yell at you from the couch if there's things that they want to change. But that's a nice thing that I typically tend to use.
Actually, well, here's a question for you, Derek. It was from Gordon. It's quite relevant as your Mac and PC. So when you shoot to the Mac into a session, do you just simply copy that whole session over to the PC? No problem. So you've got all your adjustments and settings as it was.
Yes, that's exactly what I do. Yeah, I'll typically what I'll do is I'm not backing up because I'm kind of wary about that. So what I do is I'm shooting to the desktop. So I'll just create a new session on the desktop for that current day shoot. You know, do everything in that session, and then when it's done, or there's lunch or break, I'll back it up to a drive. And then I just copy that folder over to my PC drives. And I just double click on the, you'll notice with every session, you've got a little database icon that sits on the root of the folder that you've created. And then you've got like obviously your capture and select and output folders. But that little database icon, that's essentially your executable. You just double click on that, it opens Capture One, and it's as if you were on your MacBook now on your PC. So any changes that you've made, any star ratings that clients have made, all that stuff gets brought over. So you know, it's going to save you a lot of rework. You don't have to sync anything. It's it's irrespective, and that's why I love using sessions versus like a single database for everything, because it gives you that freedom to move projects around anywhere without breaking anything.
Yeah,
because the links they're dynamic. It's focused for what's within those folders versus it being like right down to like a root directory, which would just mess things up beyond belief, right? So this is
totally.
yeah. So this makes it flexible, and backing up is flexible, and then you can easily get access to things a lot quicker that way. So yeah, I would definitely recommend that's how you'd approach it.
Oh, platform agnostic, Philip says.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. And that's.
Sorry, Derek, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say, and that's the great thing about Capture One and profiles as well, right? Is that you can kind of pass those, you know, if you want a specific one for shooting and then a specific one for editing, you can kind of bring that stuff over. And the nice thing too is if you've got those files available to you and you're not necessarily always working on the same machine, you can bring those over to say like a cart for like a digital tech that would be working on set. You could bring essentially your presets over if you wanted to for like your working environment or whatever that might be on set, and have that availability. And you know, a digital tech might have his own computer on set, and then at the end of the day he's just backing it up to a drive and giving it to you. It's nice to know that all that stuff that's been worked hard on through the set is literally all in that one folder. So
yep. Listen, a couple of people asked, you mentioned a scenario earlier on about copying and applying sort of layers from one image to another.
Sure.
But how do you sort of then deal with, you know, obviously the model isn't necessarily going to be in exactly the same place, so your masks might be different, but you might want the same.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we ran into with this one couture fashion set that we shot a couple weeks ago. Was every image had the same contrast and grade because it was shot that way, so that it would easy. We could edit one image and then apply it. So for example, let's just do a quick example. So we've got this edit. We like how it looks. You know, we've got this layer. What we can do is we can right click and we can go, but let's do one thing in here.
Yeah.
So let's just do her eyes as a separate layer. So we have the example with a mask, just so you can kind of see how I would approach this. So
okay, I can see a mask on her eyes. That's good.
Okay, yeah, she's looking at you like Superman.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I painted those in, and let's say, so we turn the mask off so we can see what we're doing. And let's say we want to bring in just some detail on the shadows in her eyes, and let's say we're there. That's where we want it to be. So we're like, okay, this is the image, or I should say the layer, the style that we want to apply to, let's say, this image, right?
Yeah.
Or actually, yeah, let's do that. So we've got it here. Yeah, so what we'll do is if you're on PC, you can go Control-Shift-C, that's what I use, but you can go here and you can click on Copy Adjustments. So what this is going to do is it's going to copy everything that's happened to this one specific image. And we'll go up to the other image here. We'll F8, so we've got a variant, and we'll right click and we'll click Apply Images. So we'll do that, and you'll notice, oh, there's the eyes, right? You can see we've applied the color grade that we wanted, and we might adjust it a bit just from lighting changes, but we can see that the eyes are there. Now, that can be a bit of an issue, so let's just undo. Now, if we make a sample image here, so let's say we make another variant of this one, because we don't want to affect this one. We've already done it. We like it. We've got this here. What we can do, if we look at the mask, we've got it here. We know the adjustments are exactly how we want her eyes to be. So all we're going to do is we're going to clear the mask. So what we've done here now is the adjustments are still there, but it's not applied to anything in the image. So now if we actually go right click, copy adjustments, and now unfortunately this example obviously doesn't have her eyes, but what we can do is then we can right click, apply adjustments. That layer is there on eyes. All we need to do is go into a brush and now brush in the eyes, and the effect is the exact same as the previous image.
Yeah.
So that's essentially what I did with the model. Was her hands were a bit red, and we did a skin uniformity across it and got the color tone to match with the hands to match the face. And then what we did was we cleared the mask and then applied it to all the images that were going to be exported, and then went in and manually painted the mask for each hand. And then essentially we had the effect already there and done, and it was nice and quick. So that's something that we've used to kind of speed things up in the past.
What I showed Derek when you were doing a quick exit and enter again was that you can actually move a mask as well. So if you're lucky enough that between frames that the mask is okay, it just needs a bit of a shift.
Yeah, you can click and drag it. Yeah,
command click with the brush tool. Let's not risk it on the Mac.
Yeah,
and drag to move the mask, and then you could obviously do the same on the PC as well. So obviously you need a bit of luck to do that, but you know, if you've got a bunch of images where the pose is very static and almost similar, but you need to move it across, then it's pretty easy to do so.
Yeah, and if you're looking to stack images like previous and before and after, and you want to look at things, you can hold Control on PC and click, and you can put more than one. Like, it'll take as many as you want to do it until, I think, what is it? It's probably
16, I think, 12 or 16.
And then it just does it.
Also depend on your screen as well. That's also nice for clients to get an impression of how far the images come as well.
Exactly, for sure. So for example, here, this was captured, brought in. You can actually see sometimes if I'm tethered, I'm actually quite lazy. I don't try and balance my white balance at all on set. Unless there's a specific thing, like if it's an outfit, like this was shot for a magazine editorial, so I wasn't really worried about reproduction. I could get very close to the color just by eyeballing it myself. But if you're doing fashion, obviously where there's color reproduction is mandatory, then I'll have a gray card on set, typically like a one right or something like that, where you can select the colors and match those colors to where they need to be. But on sets like this where it's loose and it's quick and everything, you know, I'll just pick something like daylight typically, and I'll just leave it on daylight the whole time and shoot with that, just because I know it's going to be consistent. It's not going to shift from image to image like it would be if you were on auto white balance. And then I just need to make one adjustment, and it applies it to all the images after the fact. So in that way, I've kind of, Capture One has made me not lazy, but, you know, more efficient, I would say, is probably the better word.
More efficient is the better word.
Yeah, so if, for example, in this image, you know, this was shot handheld. It wasn't on a tripod. So as good as we can, you know, we're still shooting down a tiny viewfinder, even though, you know, it was a full frame camera. So it wasn't quite as straight as I wanted it to be. So I made a quick change. So let's just do, we'll just do a quick change here. And if you notice, now I'm just trying to remember where I put my crop tool, because it could be anywhere. I believe it's right here. But it might be, oh, here it is. So this is if you wanted something specific. But if you're doing straightening, you can just pull it from up here. So there's a straighten, which gives you kind of the ability of drawing a line, right? So you could say, okay, well, I have a perfect line in the image. Let's just use that and let it go. So that would be a really easy way of doing it. Sometimes I find I'll do that, and then I'll do like a free rotate just to slightly adjust it, just because I am using a tablet, and if you've used a tablet before, trying to lift a pen off the page and keep it straight is like it's impossible. So because it always wants to move a little bit as you lift it up. So I always like doing just a quick adjustment afterwards. And obviously it's going to crop down to the edge because there's no information over there. So this is where sometimes it might not make sense in this image specifically, because I don't want to lose this information down here. I would actually, for the client, I might do it, but for me, I would probably leave it as is and not crop it, move it into Photoshop and do a content aware, just so I had some extra background, and then I could move it over. So this was one of the options for a cover shoot, and then with the other cover shoot, we ended up, the cover image, we expanded the background quite a bit and moved it over. And if you've got a complex background, typically I'll shoot large plates as well, so that I've got some information to work from in post as well. And then, so obviously we want to do a white balance kind of shift. Sometimes you can use this gray and it'll work. Sometimes I find it tends to fall, it gets the grays where it needs to be, but it tends to, like all white balances, skin tends to suffer. So for this example, I believe I did a couple shifts. So let's just take a look and we'll deconstruct this one where we went to. So, so like I said, color correction we've got here. The mask is there. It's just a full screen, and we can kind of see the shift here. So the change was obviously turned up the heat a bit, and I believe there was a bit of a shift afterwards as well in here. So I did bring up the highlights a bit because gray is gray, but I wanted it to have a bit more of a warmer green feel to it. So I did bring up the highlight a bit on this one as well. Now, if you notice, the skin wasn't quite where I wanted to do it, so I did adjustment for that as well. So as you can see, this is super loose because the nice thing about this is when you're doing skin uniformity, and this is something we haven't talked about yet on here, and some of you guys might be familiar with the tool, but we'll go through it really quick. You'll notice with skin tones, there's reds and oranges, you know, yellows, everything is kind of a shift, but there isn't this uniformity to the skin tone, and usually typical, you know, finished images will have that uniformity to it. And typically in the past, you would have to kind of painstakingly do it all in Photoshop. You know, you'd select a color here, sample, paint, you know, on a color layer. Here, basically what I've done is I've done a loose mask because I know that I'm only going to be targeting the skin tones. So I don't have to worry about the background because it's gray or blue. It's not going to affect it. So let's turn the mask off, and we'll kind of see what I've done with the skin. So if we, I think I put it in here. We'll have to see where. See, you can see this is a bit of a mess right now. It needs some cleaning up.
Color editor, I think it was in your second tab.
Oh, it's because it's minimized. Yeah. There we go. Okay, so if you notice in color editor, we have this skin tone tab. And what you can do is, let's just use this as an example. You can select, what you do is you select the skin tone that you desire, not the one that is the commonality. So for example, if we like this here, oops, I am on the black and white. I need to make sure that I select the skin tone depth. So we select that. So you can see it's selected kind of this range of skin tone. I typically expand this all the way out because I find that it affects the overall skin tone range a little bit better. Now we've got 6 sliders here, or 7, I guess. Smoothness is going to change the mask, essentially what's selected. So if we click on View Selected Color Range, you'll notice everything else goes black and white, but the color tone that we have selected, the range. So you're like, okay, well, if there's areas that are obviously black and white in here in her skin, we're not going to affect those, and so we're going to want to expand that range either this way or whatever to get that. If you want to modify this, you can affect the center and the luminance there as well. So we'll go back to this. We want to make sure that obviously if we're working on a new layer, we're working on the background here, so that's okay. But if we're working on a new layer called skin, we want to make sure it's filled. Otherwise, you're going to wonder why the skin tones aren't changing. So what we've got here is we've got uniformity. So this amount is going to affect the overall look of the hue, and then the uniformity is, this is the blending tool. So what this is going to do is if we go hue and we pull this to the right, it's going to start shifting the hues. Now she's pretty close, but you'll notice in some areas it will shift the hue to a more, the reds will go and whatnot. Now we notice there's a lack of, this isn't hue, this is a lack of saturation in her hand versus her stomach. So if we actually bring saturation over, you'll notice it actually starts to, sorry, I'm running over top of my headphones here. You'll notice the saturation gets pulled from her skin, and now the saturation in here is a lot more uniform. And you'll actually see probably the hue shift a lot more here as well. And then lightness tends to bring up the balance. Now, I typically don't use this too much because you'll notice it makes the skin very flat. But where I found this extremely useful was on hands. If you were doing a little bit of retouching on hands, but you didn't want to do a lot of it in Photoshop, if you notice, like, for example, the veins, let's just zoom in here. on her hands here, you can see that there's some shadow in there. And if we bring up that lightness, it's a lot less apparent. So I use that specifically in that lookbook that we were working on for that fashion company, was to kind of reduce some of the work that we had, and we use this for that specifically. But typically I leave this down if it's an overall skin tone image that or the overall image that I'm affecting. And then some of the stuff you can kind of bring down again, so it's not super strong, or you can leave it up, and if it's on a new layer that's just skin, you can bring down that opacity overall effect as well. That is also an option. Now this is going to affect the color, right? We've brought the uniformity to like a happy center point, but it looks fake. So what we're going to do is we can start to shift. You can see we can shift the hue to a more red, or to a more kind of we're bringing kind of the teals in, the cyan versus the magenta into the skin tones. So we can move it over this way a bit. You see saturation we can obviously affect, so let's bring down that a little bit, and then we can affect the lightness of the skin tone as well. So we can get something like that that is a little bit more pleasing versus what we had originally. Now you'll probably say, oh well, now her lips are messed up, right? Or her eye, because it was within that skin tone. The great thing is, because this is because I was on the background, this won't work. But if we were on a new layer and we had a mask, you could go in with the erase, and you could just erase around the lips and on the eyes to remove any areas that would be affected that you wouldn't like. But if you've noticed in here now, her ear is consistent throughout, and it might be a bit much, so you might want to tone it down. But the nice thing about this is now we have this uniform skin tone across the body that we don't necessarily have to go back and fix. So like, for example, in this one, for her lips, we can just bring up the eraser tool, and we can go in here and, oh, I'm probably going to screw this up because
let's see what happens here. It's fine now. Eraser tool seems to be good. Yeah.
and there. So now we've got that the warmer pinks that are in her lips there. So that's a really super useful tool. That's skin uniformity. I use it all the time. It depends on the individual, and obviously their circulation in their skin and stuff like that, because obviously if you're working with a lot of models, they're going to be a bit skinnier, their circulation is a little bit poorer, and they're going to have a lot more veins and kind of red discoloration in their hands from their veins, and that's where it's nice to kind of blend those a little bit and save yourself some time in post. And then obviously eyes I do separate, because that's going to be a shift in something that I just want to affect a specific area, and it's just very subtle to bring in some shadows, and then the overall grade that I wanted to apply to that. So what I had done was a color correction to get it to where I needed it to be, and then the actual grade. Because now you're wondering, why wouldn't you just do all the grade in one layer? So let's say I have a ton of images, but the light is shifting throughout the day. If I'm shooting in natural light, the color correction is going to be different for individual images depending on that time of day. But the grade, the overall grade that I want to apply to the images, is going to be the same. So in the past, it would be really hard to do that, because you would basically be focused on, well, now I have to adjust the colors to kind of get them to match each other for every image. Here, what I'm doing is, all I would go in, I would apply this to every image in the set, but what I would do is I would go into the color correction layer specifically, and I would just tune it to get it to that safe spot where it's neutralized for all the images. And then that grade, I don't have to do anything to it, because it's going to be the same for all those images, because now they're at a neutral point. So that's why I like to kind of separate those things out in layers, because I find that it's going to speed up your overall workflow that way, and consistency as well. Because if you're only working on one image here and there, it's okay to be a little bit more loose. But when you're working on series sets, editorials, campaigns where there has to be consistency through the images, this is something you definitely need.
Definitely. Fantastic. And I think that was a great note to finish on, because we've overrun our time slot as well, unfortunately.
Awesome.
So I told you an hour goes quickly.
It does. Well, hopefully it was useful for you guys. Hope you enjoyed it.
Definitely. Everyone's been very complimentary and everything. Just a couple of people asked, can you save any questions that you guys asked about saving presets or applying presets as styles. If you go back 1 week, I think, in the webinar archive on YouTube. So tomorrow you'll get a newsletter, well, not a newsletter, but just a follow-up email which tells you where you can watch the recordings. The layers webinar has a little bit about applying presets to layers and styles to layers. So that's all perfectly possible as well. Derek, I'm just going to steal the presentership back from you, just so I can put up next webinar, which is probably going to have not as much appeal as this one. It's specifically for Capture One Express for Sony. So if you know anyone with a Sony camera who hasn't tried Capture One and wants to have a look at the free version of Capture One, that's what I'll be talking about next week. And also how you can upgrade from Express to Pro and what extra benefits you get. So if you know anyone with a Sony, send them this way for January 11th as well. And if you want to follow Derek, actually what we're Derek, if I can, I'll include your social media stuff in tomorrow's email. So if you send that to me in any ways that people can follow you, then I'll include that in the follow-up email.
Definitely, for sure. And just one other note too is right now I've just got I'm kind of taken over the Instagram account for Capture One right now, and there's a lot of stories that kind of more the humanistic stories behind some of the images that I've captured in the past. So if you want to check those out, jump on Instagram, onto Capture One's Instagram account and read through those stories.
Excellent. Yeah, and that was, what was that, all this week, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah.
Yep. So if you go to Capture One Pro, that's our Instagram account, and and you'll see Derek there with a whole bunch of images as well. Okay. Well, all right, Derek, thanks again for your time. Back to
thanks for having me.
minus 30-degree weather for you again, and survive the winter out there in Calgary.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Well, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. Take care and talk to you soon. Thanks, Derek.
Thanks.
Bye.